30,000 feet above the Atlantic. The night flight is a sanctuary of dim blue light and soft engine hums. In the back, a 40-year-old single dad helps his daughter with her headphones. In business class, a 52-year-old billionaire races against a corporate deadline. Suddenly, a thud. A tablet hits the floor. The billionaire clutches his chest, gasping. "Is there a doctor on board?" the attendant cries. The cabin erupts in panic. The single dad stands up. He isn't a doctor, but he knows exactly what to do. In minutes, the entire cabin will fall completely silent. David Miller was a man defined by the steady rhythm of the sea. At 40 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades as a marine engineer, working on massive offshore platforms where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride away. His hands were calloused, his eyes used to scanning horizons for trouble before it arrived. But for the last 6 years, his world had shrunk to the size of a small suburban house and the bright, inquisitive eyes of his daughter, Maya. When his wife passed away, the vast oceans felt too empty. He moved to a desk job at the port, trading the salt spray for school runs and bedtime stories. Yet the training never left him. On the oil rigs, everyone was a first responder. David had completed advanced first aid and CPR certifications more times than he could count. He was a man of procedures, a man who knew that in a crisis, panic was the only thing more dangerous than the injury itself. As they boarded the flight, Maya clutched her teddy bear, her eyes wide with the nervous excitement of a 9-year-old. "Daddy, are planes safe?" she whispered as the metal tube pressurized. David strapped her in, checking the buckle twice, a habit of a man who left nothing to chance. "They're built on procedures, Maya," he said, his voice a calm anchor. "Thousands of people have worked together to make sure every bolt and every wire does exactly what it's supposed to. We're in good hands." He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just a father providing the comfort of logic. In his backpack, tucked neatly between a coloring book and a change of clothes, was a small, professional-grade medical kit, a relic of his offshore days that he never traveled without. He was prepared for a scraped knee or a sudden fever, never imagining he would be using it for something far more grave. In the front of the aircraft, Marcus Thorne lived in a world where time was the only currency he couldn't earn more of. At 52, he was a titan of the tech industry, a billionaire whose every tweet could move markets. He was flying to London to close a merger that would redefine his empire. His life was a blur of private jets and high-stakes meetings, but today he had taken a commercial flight to save time after a last-minute schedule change. Marcus was a man who pushed his body as hard as his company's. He had a history of high blood pressure, a warning from his doctors he had treated like a minor bug in a software update. He had skipped dinner to finish a proposal, fueled only by black coffee and the adrenaline of the deal. To Marcus, the people in the back of the plane were just numbers on a consumer report. He didn't know that his life was about to depend on one of them. The transition from order to chaos was instantaneous. One moment, the cabin was a peaceful sanctuary of white noise. The next, it was a theater of desperation. When Marcus's tablet hit the floor, it sounded like a gavel, bringing a meeting to an abrupt, violent end. He slumped forward, his face turning a terrifying shade of gray. The lead flight attendant, a seasoned professional named Clara, reached him in seconds. She saw the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his fingers clawed at his shirt. She knew the signs. She grabbed the intercom, her voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable edge of urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency. Is there a doctor or licensed medical professional on board?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 300 people holding their breath. David heard the announcement from row 42. He felt a familiar jolt of adrenaline, the procedure brain kicking in. He looked at Maya. She was looking at him, her eyes reflecting the fear of the cabin. "Stay here, honey. Stay in your seat," David said, his voice low and firm. He didn't hesitate. He stood up, grabbing his backpack. He wasn't a doctor, and he knew the risks of stepping forward in a litigious world, but he also knew that 30,000 feet up, there was no room for ego or hesitation. He walked past the curious stares of passengers, moving with a purposeful stride that cut through the mounting panic. He reached the curtain separating the cabins and saw the chaos. Clara was struggling to keep Marcus upright. David stepped into the light. "I'm not a doctor," he said, catching Clara's eye, "but I'm certified in advanced CPR and offshore emergency response. Let me help." The atmosphere in the business class cabin was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of fear. Clara looked at David, seeing the calm in his eyes, a stark contrast to the billionaire's gasping struggle. She nodded, stepping aside. Under the strict regulations of the airline, a certified first responder could assist when no doctor was present. David knelt beside Marcus. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw a human being in the middle of a systemic failure. Marcus was conscious, but barely. His eyes were unfocused, darting around the cabin like a trapped animal. David took Marcus's wrist, feeling for a pulse. It was thready, rapid, and irregular. Marcus was clammy to the touch. "Marcus, my name is David," he said, his voice loud enough to be heard over the engine hum, but soft enough to be soothing. "I need you to look at me. Breathe with me. Slow and deep." David's mind began running through the if-then logic of his training. Is it a heart attack, a stroke, or a severe drop in blood pressure combined with exhaustion? He turned to Clara. "We need the AED on standby and the onboard medical kit. Now, and get me a blood pressure cuff." He didn't wait for them to arrive. He gently guided Marcus to the floor, laying him flat on his back, the proper position to maximize blood flow to the brain and heart. He loosened the billionaire's silk tie, unbuttoning his collar. He was methodical, ignoring the gasps from the other business class passengers who were watching their hero crumble. David was creating a bubble of professional focus in a world that was falling apart. He was the engineer again, diagnosing a critical failure in a high-pressure system. As the equipment arrived, the cabin fell into a profound, respectful silence. The only sounds were the Velcro tear of the blood pressure cuff and the rhythmic beep of the monitor. David's hands were steady as he pumped the bulb. The reading was dangerously low. Marcus's heart was racing to compensate for a lack of fluid and oxygen. He wasn't having a full cardiac arrest yet, but he was on the doorstep. David looked at the flight crew. "He's in hypovolemic shock, or a severe hypertensive crisis that's tipped over. He needs oxygen and a steady flow of fluids if we have them. But mostly, we need to keep his heart from stopping." David stayed on the floor, his knees pressing into the carpet, his eyes locked on Marcus. He began a series of controlled breathing exercises, literally teaching the billionaire how to survive the next 10 minutes. The emotional peak of the moment wasn't the medical jargon, but the connection. Marcus reached out, his hand trembling, and gripped David's forearm. His knuckles were white. The man who owned the world was clinging to a stranger's arm like a child. "Am I dying?" Marcus whispered, the question barely audible. David didn't lie. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He gripped Marcus's hand back, a firm, grounding pressure. "Not on my watch, Marcus. But you have to listen to me. Your heart is working too hard. Give it a rest. Focus on my voice. In for 4, out for 4. We're going to get you to the ground." In that moment, the billions of dollars in Marcus's bank account meant nothing. The tablet on the floor was just a piece of plastic. The only thing that mattered was the breath in his lungs and the hand of the marine engineer holding him steady. The rest of the cabin felt the shift. The panic had been replaced by a collective prayer for success. Passengers in the back were whispering to one another, passing word down that someone was helping. In row 42, Maya sat perfectly still, holding her teddy bear, her heart full of a terrifying pride for her father. She knew he wasn't a superhero in a cape, but she knew he was the man who fixed things. The flight attendants worked around David like a well-oiled machine, following his lead. They were no longer just servers of drinks and snacks. They were a medical team. This was the beauty of human synchronization in the face of disaster. David was the conductor, and the cabin was his orchestra, playing a silent symphony of survival. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus's color began to return, ever so slightly. The oxygen was helping. David never let go of his hand. He kept talking, telling Marcus about the sea, about the way the waves look at night, using the cadence of his voice to regulate the billionaire's heart rate. He was using every ounce of his training, not just the physical steps, but the psychological warfare against death. He knew that the mind could often give up before the body did. He wouldn't let that happen. He was the anchor, and he was holding the ship against the storm. The cabin remained silent, a sanctuary of shared humanity at 30,000 feet, where a single dad was teaching a billionaire that the most important thing in life isn't power, but the person sitting next to you. The stability was fragile. Just as Marcus seemed to even out, the monitor emitted a sharp, jagged alarm. His heart rhythm had turned into a chaotic flutter, atrial fibrillation. The risk of a full cardiac arrest doubled in an instant. David felt Marcus's grip tighten convulsively. "The AED," David commanded, his voice slicing through the air. Clara moved to open the device. The procedure brain was now in overdrive. David had to make a choice. If he used the AED and the plane shifted or he made a mistake, he could be held responsible for the outcome. But if he didn't, Marcus might not make it to the next airport. He didn't think about the legalities. He thought about Maya. He thought about what he would want someone to do for him. "Stay back," David warned the flight attendants as he prepared the pads. He looked at Marcus. "Marcus, stay with me. This is going to be a jolt." But before he pressed the button, he checked the pulse one more time. It was still there, albeit weak. He decided to wait. He knew that sometimes the body could reset itself with enough oxygen and calm. He opted for a more conservative approach first, continuing the guided breathing and repositioning Marcus to optimize his airway. He was gambling with seconds. The pilot's voice came over the headset in Clara's ear. They were 20 minutes from an emergency diversion in the Azores. "Tell the captain we need every second he can give us," David said without looking up. "We are on the edge." During a moment of lucidity, Marcus looked up at David. The billionaire's eyes were wet with tears. "Don't let me miss that meeting," he wheezed, the old habits of a lifetime of greed still flickering in his dying light. David looked at him with a stern, almost fatherly gaze. "Marcus, look at me. Forget the meeting. Forget the merger. Right now, the only meeting that matters is with the ground, and I'm the one making sure you show up for it in one piece. You have a heart, Marcus. Start using it for something other than stress." The cabin went dead silent. It was a confrontation between two ways of living, one that valued the result and one that valued the process. Marcus's eyes widened, and then slowly he nodded. He let go of the thought of the deal. He surrendered. The surrender worked. As Marcus let go of the mental tension, his heart rate began to dip back into a manageable range. The flutter smoothed out. David watched the monitor like a hawk, his finger never leaving Marcus's pulse point. He was exhausted, his own muscles cramping from the awkward position on the floor, but he didn't move. He became a human monument to vigilance. He coordinated with the flight crew to prepare Marcus for the descent. They had to be careful. The change in cabin pressure during an emergency dive could trigger another episode. David instructed the crew on how to monitor the Billionaire while he went back to check on Maya. He needed her to know he was okay. When David walked back to row 42, the passengers he passed didn't just look at him. They leaned in, offering silent nods of respect. He reached Maya, who jumped into his arms. "Is he okay, Daddy?" she whispered. David squeezed her tight. The scent of her hair ground him back to reality. "He's stable, Maya. We're going to land early so he can go to the hospital. You did great. You followed the procedure." He sat with her for a moment, his heart finally slowing down. But his job wasn't done. As the plane tilted into its steep descent toward the Azores, David returned to the front. He stayed with Marcus through the landing, holding his hand as the wheels hit the tarmac with a jarring thud. The transition to professional medical care was seamless. The doors opened, and the paramedics rushed in. David stepped back, providing a concise, clinical handoff. Male, 52. Suspected hypertensive crisis leading to shock. History of AFib. Pulse stable, but weak. Responded to oxygen and repositioning. The paramedics nodded, impressed by the clarity of the report. As they loaded Marcus onto the stretcher, the Billionaire reached out one last time. He grabbed David's hand, not in fear this time, but in a gesture of profound, humble gratitude. "I don't even know your name," Marcus whispered. David smiled. "I'm David. I'm a marine engineer. Just remember what I said about the roots, Marcus. Take care of yours." The emergency landing in the Azores was a whirlwind of paperwork and logistics. Because of the medical diversion, the flight had to remain on the ground for several hours. David and Maya were moved to a quiet lounge in the small terminal. Maya was exhausted, curled up on a plastic chair with her head in David's lap. He watched the sunrise over the Atlantic, the orange light reflecting off the wings of the grounded Boeing 777. He felt a strange sense of emptiness. The adrenaline had washed away, leaving only a profound fatigue. He wasn't thinking about the Billionaire's money or the fame that might follow. He was thinking about how fragile life was, and how lucky he was to be sitting there with his daughter. A few days after they finally reached London, David received a phone call at his hotel. It was a personal assistant from Marcus Thorne. The Billionaire was in a private clinic, recovering from what turned out to be a severe case of exhaustion-induced heart failure. He wanted to see David. When David arrived at the clinic, he expected a scene from a movie. Cameras, lawyers, a big check. Instead, he found Marcus sitting in a sun-drenched room, looking remarkably small in a hospital gown. There were no tablets, no phones, no assistants, just a man and a view of a garden. Marcus looked at David and smiled. "The doctors say that if you hadn't adjusted the airflow and kept me calm, my heart would have stopped before we reached the islands. You saved more than my life, David. You saved my perspective." Marcus didn't offer David a job or a suitcase full of cash. He knew David wasn't that kind of man. Instead, he asked about Maya. He asked about the sea. They talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with technology or finance. Marcus confessed that he had spent the last decade running away from his own life, using work as a shield against the loneliness of his own success. "I saw you with your daughter on the plane," Marcus said. "I saw the way you looked at her before you stood up. You have something I can't buy, David. You have a foundation." It was a moment of true human revelation, The billionaire was learning that the man he had looked down on from his business class seat was actually the one standing on higher ground. The motif of planting returned when David and Maya went back home. They had a small balcony in their apartment where they grew herbs and small flowers. Maya was fascinated by the process, the way a tiny seed could push through the dirt to find the light. "Daddy," she asked one afternoon while they were watering the plants, "was that man on the plane very important? People on the news are talking about him." David knelt down beside her, his hands in the soil. "Everyone is important, Maya, especially at 30,000 feet. Up there, it doesn't matter how much money you have in your pocket. It only matters if you have someone to help you breathe. Marcus was just a man who forgot how to do that. We just helped him remember." The metaphor of the flight stayed with them. David realized that his life as a marine engineer had prepared him for more than just fixing engines. It had prepared him to be a steward of life. He began volunteering to teach CPR and first aid classes at the local community center. He wanted to make sure that more people were prepared ghosts in the machines of modern life. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be a catalyst. He saw Maya growing up with the same calm, procedural mind, a girl who wouldn't panic when the world got shaky. He had planted a seed of resilience in her, and he watched it grow with more pride than any corporate achievement could ever provide. Marcus Thorne did change, too. He stepped down as CEO, taking a chairman role that allowed him to spend more time on philanthropic efforts that focused on rural health care and emergency response training. He sent David a letter every few months, usually with a photo of a garden he was starting at his estate. He didn't become a monk, but he became a man who breathed. He understood now that the merger that mattered most was the one between his ambition and his humanity. He had been saved by a man who knew that when the cabin falls silent, the only thing that speaks is the character you've built in the quiet years before the storm. A year later, Marcus Thorne made a final grand gesture, but it wasn't the kind the tabloids expected. He contacted David with an offer to fund a massive STEM scholarship program for children from working-class families, the Marine Engineering and Emergency Response Initiative. He wanted David to lead the board. David accepted, but only on one condition. The scholarship had to be named after the flight crew and the emergency response training, not after Marcus or David. "This isn't about us," David told him over a video call. "It's about the procedure. It's about making sure the next time a plane falls silent, there's someone in row 42 who knows what to do." The final scene of the story takes place on another flight. David and Maya are traveling again, this time for a vacation Marcus had insisted on sponsoring. They are sitting in the same economy seats David always prefers. Maya is 10 now, more confident, her headphones on as she watches a movie. The plane hit a patch of moderate turbulence, the cabin shaking with the familiar, rhythmic vibration of a ship at sea. A few passengers gasped, clutching their armrests. Maya didn't flinch. She looked at the wing, then at her father. "It's just the air pockets, right, Daddy? The procedure handles it." David nodded, a sense of profound peace washing over him. "That's right, Maya. We're just moving through the steps." Maya turned to him, her expression serious. "Daddy, were you scared that night? With the man in the front?" David looked out the window at the endless blue of the Atlantic. "Of course I was, honey. I was terrified, but that's why I followed the steps. Fear is just a signal to start the procedure. If you focus on what you have to do, you don't have time to be afraid of what might happen." He realized then that this was the greatest gift he could ever give her, the ability to face the unknown with a plan. He wasn't just a father, he was an architect of her soul. The cabin remained peaceful. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with their carts, a routine dance of service and safety. David looked around at the other passengers. He saw the billionaire-to-be in his suit, the tired mother with her infant, the elderly couple holding hands. He saw them all as a single unit, a fragile ecosystem suspended in the sky. He knew that any one of them could become a patient, and any one of them could become a savior. The titles had disappeared. The bank accounts were irrelevant. There was only the shared breath of 300 people traveling through the clouds. At 30,000 feet, titles disappear. The gold cards and the executive titles are just weight in a pocket. Procedures matter. People matter. David Miller wasn't a hero in the way the world defines it. He didn't have a cape, and he didn't seek the spotlight. He was simply a man who was prepared. And as he watched Maya fall asleep against his shoulder, he knew that sometimes preparation is the most profound form of love. He closed his eyes, the hum of the engines a familiar lullaby, knowing that as long as there were people willing to stand up in the silence, the world would keep moving forward, one breath, one step, and one procedure at a time. The final line of the story is a quiet echo for every soul who has ever felt small in a big world. He wasn't a doctor, and he wasn't a billionaire. He was a father. And in the thin air of the Atlantic, that was more than enough to change the world. CTA for High TL Stories Channel. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story of courage and humanity at 30,000 feet. It's a reminder that we all have the potential to be someone's hero, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet strength of being prepared and staying human. If David's story inspired you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to know that their skills and their heart matter, no matter their title. Don't forget to subscribe to High TL Stories and hit that notification bell so you never miss a journey with us. We believe in the power of stories to bridge the gap between the boardroom and the basement. Have you ever had to step up in a crisis, or has a stranger ever changed your life with a simple act of kindness? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our community. Until next time, stay prepared, stay kind, and remember, we're all in this together. See you in the next story.